Want me to go ahead and get it started? Welcome, everyone. I'd like to get started with our meeting this morning. This meeting is being audio and video recorded. My name is Chuck Larson. I'm the manager of strategic projects with the town of Nantucket. This is a project kickoff meeting with our consultants, Phil Thomason and Lisa Craig. We'll hear about their background and experience in a few moments. With the assistance of Phil and Lisa, this project will be assisting the community and the town with developing an approach to resilience planning that focuses on our cultural and historic resources.
Chuck, could you use the mic, please?
Specifically, we will be developing guidelines for protecting and adapting our historic properties to the impact from climate change and sea level rise. Nantucket is on the front lines of impacts from sea level rise and has choices to make with changing conditions. This is a state of Massachusetts MVP action grant project. We received funding for this project through a competitive process. A year ago, and geez, it seems so much longer, we held the state-sponsored MVP workshop, and we produced a final report with a risk matrix and a prioritized list of actions. Priority number 4 is the need for this project to develop guidelines to preserve historic streetscapes and properties while mitigating hazards and building resiliency. And that MVP report is on the website along with everything that you'll see here today. And you'll see that information in a bit. Attending remotely, I believe, is Courtney Rocha. Courtney, are you on? She was going to try to make it. She's our direct contact with the state and the MVP coordinator for the Southeast region. Attending, we also have Libby Gibson, our town manager, Greg Tivenin and Rachel Day, assistant town managers. Also, Holly Backus, the town's historic preservation planner, and Vince Murphy, the coastal resilience coordinator. We also have representation from the Nantucket Historical Commission, the Historic District Commission. There are several project partners, including Preservation Institute Nantucket, and the University of Florida Historic Preservation Program. And finally, before turning this over to Lisa, our town manager, Libby Gibson, would like to make a few remarks.
Thank you. Is this on? I hate when people do this. Thank you guys very much. Thank you all for coming. We very much appreciate it. I just wanted to make a couple of points. This is a stakeholder meeting, and there will be other public meetings that are publicly advertised and noticed after this. But we haven't typically advertised these stakeholder meetings. Very similar to later on this afternoon. I think some people, I don't know who all is involved here. Holly is. We have a community wildfire protection plan stakeholders meeting with the group from the state that is doing that plan for us, and following that there will be other public meetings, just so people know and understand. Although, as Chuck said, this meeting is being video and audio recorded. We have this project, the MVP grant project, I'm not going to go into repeating what Chuck just said as to what it's all about, but it also has to do with keeping in mind the need for resiliency measures going forward. We have a lot of activities going on in the town with respect to resiliency. We have a coastal resiliency plan in the works. We have a climate action plan that is going to be getting underway. We just got our designation as a green community, and there will be elements of that plan that relate to resiliency. We have the hazard mitigation plan, and there are probably other plans and activities and programs that are going to all be eventually working into resiliency as either their direct issue to deal with or peripherally an issue to deal with. We're working on a sustainability plan and a kind of a framework through which a lot of capital and maybe other projects are going to be ultimately going through as we design and develop them going forward, keeping resiliency in mind. A year ago, we completed the MVP Community Resilience Planning Workshop. I think a number of you were at that. We developed a risk matrix and identified 10 high priority actions for the town. This project, as Chuck may have mentioned this, was our 4th priority in our final report. Priority 1 on that list was establishing a coastal resiliency coordinator, which we have done, and I think everybody hopefully by now has met Vince. Community and coastal resilience means helping the town prepare for and quickly recover from the impacts from climate change and sea level rise. We are very definitely starting to see those things happening in our community. Just take a look around at certain areas. Easy Street, for one thing. Greg and Chuck and I spent a great deal of time yesterday going over Easy Street flooding and why it's flooding and when, and Brendan's probably been involved in that as well. And there are things we need to really be paying attention to, but that's just one example. There are many examples of that are starting to emerge. An increasing number of our historic buildings and streetscapes are becoming vulnerable to more frequent inundation and flooding, like that issue that I just mentioned. In the MVP workshop, we identified as a significant community these things that I just talked about, the inundation of flooding and the coastal conference that we had last year as well. All of these things are being identified as significant community assets that need to be considered in our planning for resiliency going forward in our community. And this project gets us started by facilitating a dialogue in the community with all of the stakeholders, and there's probably even more, as to developing a consensus for appropriate actions and ways to move forward to maintain our historic resources. Nantucket has been recognized as a leader by including historic preservation into its community resiliency planning. We've established the position through some restructuring in the Plus department. Thank you, Andrew. He was really the leader on that. The position of preservation planner filled by Holly. Thank you, Holly. We're very glad to say that we're able to get that position in place. And I am told that Holly gets comments all the time about Nantucket's approach. Obviously, we should be a leader in the area of community resilience given our geographic situation. In closing, please support the project, spread the word. I know you all will participate in the workshops and help us create guidelines to protect and adapt our historic and cultural resources for future generations. Sorry I had to read all that, but I cannot remember everything Chuck told me to mention. So thank you all for being here. I know it's time out of your day, but it's very much appreciated, and it's for a very good cause. So thank you.
And thank you, Libby. Lisa, we have about 25 in the room here. I know you can't see us, but that will give you a sense that, we probably will get some questions from the participants.
I hope
so all yours.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate it so much, Chuck. First off, I want to say thank you to the town of Nantucket. Libby, I think you did a very critical job of overviewing what has been accomplished to this point. And I think it's terrific that we're moving quickly into implementation of your 10 priorities. So we're very happy, Phil and I, to be part of that. I'm going to start it here in, I can advance my slides.
So we see your first slide, Lisa.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get to, there we go. I just had a hard time getting it through. Okay. This is just the overview of our presentation. So I know we've got 25 or so people there. I think I probably know a number of the organizations that may be represented in the room. I don't want to go through a long list of introductions, but it would be good for Phil and I, and again, we apologize for not being there, but we will actually have to be there probably no less than 4 more times in the next 6 months. So you will see our faces frequently, and I appreciate this opportunity to do this kickoff meeting remotely. But for purposes of introductions, Phil and I can certainly spend a few minutes talking about our background and our experience and relevance to this project. It would be useful for all of us to know who, what agencies or organizations are represented. We'll get the full list. But perhaps, Chuck, I assume you know most of the folks in the room, if you could just give us a quick representation of the organizations represented, and if there are some key individuals as well, we'd be glad to know who those are, because the following remarks remarks will tie in very much to everybody in the room.
Right. I think Holly, given her role, would probably, and
Sure.
knowledge of who's here, would do a better job with that. So I'm going to pass that to her.
Hi, Lisa and
Okay,
Phil.
thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So we have a plethora of people here. We have, let's see, I'll start over here. We have 2 members from our Historic District Commission. We have a member from our Historic District Commission staff. We have a member from our, Janet, and I apologize. Cultural and tourism, very key component in Nantucket. We have obviously our folks from PIN. We have our historical commission chair. We have folks from NPT. We have a representative from the Realtors Association for Nantucket, and we're very happy to have her here. We have our building commissioner, our planning director. We have the chair from the planning board. We have, of course, our town manager, assistant town managers. We have our emergency management coordinator. We have our natural resources director. And we have our chair of our Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee. That pretty much sums up everybody here.
Great, perfect, thank you. That's extremely helpful. And I think so because all of you will find that in the presentation that I'm going to be making, there is a significant role to play for all of you and in your disciplines and expertise. So that's great. Holly and Chuck, thank you again very much for pulling this team together. Phil, you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work and relevance to this project?
Certainly. Good morning, and appreciate the opportunity of working with you all on this project. I've worked as a consultant in historic preservation for the past 40 years, and we've worked in, I guess, approximately 70 to 75 communities across the country on preparing design guidelines for residential areas and commercial areas. And these range from large cities like Salt Lake City and Oklahoma City to smaller communities, mid-sized communities like Montclair, New Jersey, Olympia, Washington. So we've been around the country a lot over the last several decades. And in the last few years, our work has been concentrating more on coastal communities and the impacts that we're seeing now from flooding and sea level rise, and how do we treat our historic properties, how do we protect our historic properties, and what are the alternatives in terms of design review. We've worked in Georgetown, South Carolina, and Mandeville, Louisiana the last couple of years, and are presently working now in Brunswick, Georgia, and Beaufort, North Carolina. So this is a topic that a lot of our historic preservation commissions are having to deal with, not only on the coast, but also we've had flooding situations in interior cities and communities as well along rivers and waterways. So this is not confined just to the coast, but something that we're having to deal with really all across America. So looking forward to working with you all, and that's sort of a brief summary of the experience we've been dealing with this issue.
Thanks, Bill. And I'd also point out, Bill is actually on the board of the National Alliance of Preservation Commission. So Phil and I have participated in developing modules, or will be developing modules together, addressing disaster training and issues of sea level rise and their impact on historic districts. So again, Nantucket will likely be a model that we'll be using to train others around the country. My background, for those of you who may not have met me or spoken with me at the last Keeping History Above Water Nantucket workshop, I've been almost 30 years in the historic preservation field, have served as a state preservation officer as well as a chief of historic preservation in Washington, D.C. and Annapolis, Maryland. I was fortunate during that time to work very closely with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, as well as the Maryland Historical Trust and a number of local, state, and federal agencies in the development of the nation's first cultural resource-based hazard mitigation plan. So I have great fondness for the emergency management folks, because we had to work really closely with them, as well as business owners, the real estate community, the Chamber of Commerce, and every other local, state, and federal agency that deals with disaster planning and preparedness. During that time in developing this Weather It Together, which is what we branded the initiative, I really appreciated the opportunities for increased public awareness, not just for the educational value, but also for the ability to create a sense of urgency, but also buy-in for the adaptation of individual historic buildings at a time when most cities can't necessarily afford to do large structural seawalls and other types of projects. So on a property-by-property basis, it was very satisfying to see the property owners wanted to adapt their buildings for a future of sea level rise. And so finishing the work on the Weather It Together initiative, once that cultural resource hazard mitigation plan was approved by FEMA, I moved on to do what I thought was valuable within the preservation field, and that was to basically help other communities. So right now I'm working with St. Augustine, Florida, the town of Boulder, and the Colorado Chautauqua. Obviously, I've done some work in Nantucket, working with NAPC on developing a disaster module training for historic preservation commissions, and then just received notice of an award to work with New Bern, North Carolina, on developing a hazard mitigation and resilience plan there. So really, this is my future, and I look forward to working with all of you in Nantucket, and with Phil, and with Penn, which is a key partner in this process, to develop these guidelines and a toolkit for property owners. So I think that's it on the welcome and introductions. Unless there's anybody else that wants to say something on that item, I can move on to the next item.
Yep, keep going, Lisa.
Okay, so this is pretty much the outline of the discussion for today for the kickoff meeting. We'll have an opportunity to have comments and questions at the end, so I'm just going to proceed. Libby did a wonderful job of talking about the overview and where all of the planning efforts have brought us to this point. I always think it's important for us to remember that we do have plans in communities. The town of Nantucket has developed master plans. They've developed area plans. They've developed resilience plans, vulnerability assessments, and these are all building one off the other, and they are interrelated. And so, for example, the Nantucket Master Plan, has the protection of historical integrity of the landscape and buildings strongly as one of the community values, and that's very much what Phil and I are working towards, is to underscore those values in the community as we move through this planning process. I think Colleen and I have talked about timing is excellent for the update of the Brant Point Area Plan. And in having read through the Brant Point Area Plan, I found it very compelling that the working group identified Brant Point as a place where not only do we have residents, but visitors who stay here value the feeling of openness and proximity to the shore, the downtown area, the wonderful views, and the entire approach to Nantucket from Cape Cod. So much of what we're looking at doing with these design guidelines is identifying and protecting those key view sheds and the character of that area, as well as the other historic areas on the island. And then, of course, we have what was mentioned earlier, the fact that this is the number 4 priority, developing guidelines to preserve historic streetscapes. So Phil will be very much taking the lead on that effort, and I anticipate working with Marty Hilton and his great crew at Penn. We will be collecting information via survey during these next 6 months, and then developing a charrette where the community can participate in that, and we can get feedback on the types of adaptation strategies that will work effectively to protect the character of the many neighborhoods in Nantucket. The most recent visit I had was tied to keeping history above water. Nantucket, a number of you in the room attended that. We are now on, Marty, I think the Caribbean one is now the 6th of the Keeping History Above Water workshops or conferences. The important thing about that was very much it began with the 3D digital documentation and sea level rise visualization project that had been developed by Penn. Marty, do you want to take a minute or two just for anybody in the room who may not be familiar with it about the area of the work then and how that's led into what you're doing now?
Yeah, if you could use a microphone, please.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, this was something that we, the University of Florida Preservation Institute Nantucket, proposed about 3 years ago, and the first phase was supported by the Community Preservation Committee, and then the second phase, working with Chuck and the town, was supported through the Coastal Zone Management. So it's a methodology that we've developed. I think it's fairly unique. I think many of you, if you haven't seen it, you can go online. You just search for University of Florida Resilient Nantucket. So it says visualization, but it's actually a modeling of the sea level rise. It's a bathtub model and how the water will behave as it moves into town. And so the reason in doing it was for this purpose, for helping inform adaptation strategies, but also, I think, helping raise awareness. So is that what you wanted, Lisa?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think what's important about that is the fact that in this next phase of work on the design guidelines, Marty and I have preliminarily discussed how these design guidelines might apply to particular projects or priorities identified as the next phase of work for PIN. So again, it's really important to understand that we do build on previous work and get to the point where we actually are testing out particular adaptation strategies via design guidelines and modeling the design guidelines with actual projects in Nantucket. So there'll be more of that discussed in future meetings. So we'll be working closely with PIN on that. As part of the Nantucket work, we did complete a community values survey, an online survey to understand people's awareness of the impacts of sea level rise on Nantucket on their own properties, as well as their general knowledge about flood risk and other things. So a few slides from that gives you some sense of where the community was. And why it ties very much into the next phase of public awareness and workshop activities is about 68% of those on the island do not carry flood insurance. And so we need to do a more effective job of promoting the importance and value of carrying flood insurance. And we're going to be working closely with our FEMA partners. You're very fortunate to have some very strong and engaged people working in FEMA Region 1 that are excited about working with the town of Nantucket on this project. We also asked about how we could do a better job of increasing public awareness on flood risks and adaptation. And so again, right at the top of the list with the community was to develop and distribute design guidance. So hence, that's what we're doing. A series of these other priorities will be covered over the next 6 months through the various community workshops. So it is important for us to have real estate professionals, home buyers, those handling insurance, participating, collecting some economic data will be hopefully a later phase of this project, but really helping people understand design issues and financing of adaptation. And that information will be provided via the toolkit we'll be developing. How the town can work to develop and share tools for minimizing flood risk. Again, the 3D laser scanning project was a very high priority and obviously well underway. But again, a toolkit for adaptation is an important component for the community. And then lastly, we asked that question because of the fact that the entire island is a National Historic Landmark. The entire island is significant. But when it comes to issues of tourism, or it comes to issues of community sentiment for particular properties, or the economics of downtown and its significance to the local economy, what was it that people really wanted to see protected against flooding disasters? And the Whaling Museum came out as number one. So in essence, this is kind of a list of prioritized places. You can see Washington Street's there. I know Penn is working on the next phase of work on Washington Street. So it gives you an idea of what the community felt were some priorities in terms of adaptation planning. And these may be some things we'll incorporate as models into the testing of the guidelines as we move forward. Those are just a few stills of Penn's modeling for impacts of sea level rise. If you have not seen this yet, you should talk with Marty and get a copy of it. It's just tremendous. And I know as part of the Acclimate initiative, they'll be trying to get this information out in a variety of ways over the next year.
And Lisa,
lastly, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to add that information is available also via links on our town website, resilientac.org.
Perfect. Thank you, Chuck. And then lastly, when we talk about adaptation, I think it's really important to understand that a lot of people think about building elevation or building relocation as adaptation. There are a number of tools that FEMA recognizes as adaptation strategies. They're basically those approaches that will help reduce hazard-related losses. So everything from prevention through regulations, things like the floodplain management ordinance, development of a design flood, what we typically call a design flood elevation level for new construction or substantial improvement, how we flood-proof buildings through a variety of individual barriers, door and window dams, dry and wet flood proofing. These will all be things that we'll discuss as part of the guidelines. The big structural diversion, seawalls, public education and awareness is often an underrepresented adaptation alternative, and I think Nantucket is doing a very effective job of engaging the public on an annual basis about the importance of addressing flooding risks. So that's an important adaptation alternative. And lastly, we have to look at natural resource protection methods for landscape features and understanding we may have key archaeological sites that need to be identified and or as erosion occurs on the island, perhaps the artifacts must be monitored, or the sites monitored and the artifacts documented as we go along. So these are all a variety of adaptation strategies that FEMA incorporates into its cultural resource considerations and hazard mitigation planning. So that takes me to our project that we're working on with the town of Nantucket and Penn and a number of other partners I'll talk about. We all understand the importance of this National Historic Landmark District And again, as Chuck alluded to, and Holly has made clear, I have to tell you, Holly is on social media all the time. Every time I am looking at something about sea level rise, Holly's talking about what a great job the town of Nantucket is doing. And I'm very glad to have a colleague like her to work with, because it will take leadership from people in all aspects of the community, but particularly those of us who work with a very long view of preservation, the commissions, the staff, the preservation planners who have to work with individual resources, understand we have to plan for preservation in the long run and address the major obstacle, the major challenge we have, and that is the impact of climate change, or specific to Nantucket, sea level rise and tidal flooding and erosion. We, as a team, the Craig Group, Thomas and Associates, and our colleagues with the Preservation Institute of Nantucket are working with the town through the MVP grant, as Chuck mentioned earlier, to basically do a number of things: develop a public awareness toolkit, to develop design guidelines for the town of Nantucket's NHL, and lastly, to ensure that we're continuing to engage the public in this process and creating greater public awareness. We also are going to be working through two major initiatives already established in the town of Nantucket. Act Local, some of you may be aware of that. It's a platform for coordinating and advancing sustainability practices. It's becoming a more robust vehicle. Chuck, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about that.
Why don't you keep going, Lisa? In the interest
Sure.
of time. Yep.
And then, sure, Acclimate, which is a multi-organization partnership which is dedicated to adapting Nantucket to a changing climate. Acclimate came out of the work from PIN and has a number of partners, most of which are in the room with you today, as well as a few others. So we'll be working closely through both of those initiatives to make sure we're engaging with the public. There are a couple of phases to this project. Phase one includes a FEMA workshop on flood risk and flood insurance. And so Holly and I have already begun discussions with our FEMA partners on presentation of that workshop. We have set up the date of March 26th. We'll have a specific time as soon as we can finalize the schedule of activities, but it will be both an afternoon and evening event. The point being, we want to engage as many people as possible. There are certainly some folks who can come for a late afternoon training and information sharing on flood risk and flood insurance. But for those who have work and can't get off until 5, we'll have some type of an evening open house so that property owners, residents can come again, learn more about flood risk and learn how they can address the protection of their property through flood insurance and other means. Phase 2 is really Phil's work. And I'm going to let him kind of lead us through the next slide or two here to talk a little bit more about what goes into the development of design guidelines for building adaptation and elevation. Phil, I've got us here. There's actually the date of May 28th for that facilitated community roundtable. But other than that, you want to kind of run through this slide and then the next, which will basically show the steps that you take.
Yes, and I will be there on the 26th of March as well. I'll be coming in on the 24th and be doing my photographs and getting acclimated to the historic resources and start gathering my data. But yeah, typically in the design guidelines, we come into a community and take a great deal of photographs and have meetings with the Historic Preservation Commission members and members of the public and just get an idea of the architectural and historic resources, what are the threats, and how do we respond to those threats. The slide that you see is from Mandeville, and this is Mandeville, Louisiana, and I would encourage you to go to the city's website and take a look at the design guidelines that we prepared. Mandeville is on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana and suffered extensive flooding from Hurricane Katrina. In their historic district, next to the lake, the first 4 blocks of the historic district, they have elevated, I think, about 75 to 80% of the buildings. They just had to do that because of the flood insurance rates and FEMA requirements. So depending on where you are, we have low elevation guidelines like you see here. And what you try to do is just keep the integrity of the property as much as possible, even though you're having to take it up 3 to 4 feet. You do it by having particular details that are a focus in terms of the stairs and how you rebuild the stairs and alignment of the porch columns and foundation piers. There's a lot of different ways that we have been working with the folks in Mandeville to come up with a set of design guidelines that respects the integrity of these properties as much as possible. Right next to the water, some of these houses have had to go up anywhere from 7 to 9 feet, which is much more of a challenge. But again, there are ways to do that retains the integrity as much as you can. So anyway, we'll be working in your community for like the next few months, and again, coming up working with the commissions and the groups to develop a set of design guidelines. And so this is another slide here just showing, like for new construction, how best new construction can fit into your community, where you respect the alignment and setback and porch designs, where to put the parking, all that sort of thing. So we'll have, at the end of this process, a illustrated set of design guidelines for you, and we'll have overall design guideline elements addressed, but a specific focus on climate impact in terms of elevation, hardening properties, and that's specifically associated with commercial buildings that obviously masonry buildings that can't be elevated. And how do you harden those with the right kind of flood-proofing techniques? New construction, again, examine the potential for new construction, how to do elevation, again, in a way that is respectful to the historic buildings up and down the street. And we always try to have these guidelines to be as user-friendly as possible. All of these illustrations and photographs will be tailored to your community, and we try to just do a lot of bullet points and really focus on design guideline elements that are easy to understand. So that's really the approach that we have taken with other design guideline projects in the past, and again, encourage you to take a look at the Mandeville guidelines as an example of what a final product would look like.
Great. Thanks, Bill. As Phil mentioned, we solicit input from the community on an ongoing basis. So other than the charrette, we will have a community forum that will present the draft guidelines, and we'll have a dialogue with the community and get some of their feedback and input before we finalize the guidelines, which would then be presented at the Nantucket Preservation Trust annual meeting. Mary and I have already had a conversation. Again, we just want to align and build on our existing forums and partnerships. And NPT is doing a workshop, an annual conference this year on this issue of resilience. Clearly, it's a priority for the island. And so we'll be taking that final day to really focus on the local aspects, including presenting on the design guidelines, again, creating greater awareness on flood risk and flood adaptation. One of our priorities is to bring in other organizations, individuals who are either currently working on adapting buildings there in Nantucket or dealing with this issue from an organizational point of view. So, for example, I'm currently communicating with the National Trust in the UK, which has very similar issues of dealing with coastal erosion. They own 10% of the of the UK shoreline, and they have cultural resources, natural resources, and they're planning both for adaptation in situ as well as basically managed retreat. How you do that, how you work with a community or a neighborhood is something that they'll share their experiences on. And then lastly, we hope that this represents a model for other Massachusetts communities as they move forward with developing adaptation and elevation design guidelines. So the schedule at this point, and I think I've got these dates correct, Holly, you'll correct me if I don't, but we've got a March 26th community forum, which is basically a FEMA workshop. May 28th will be the design guidelines charrette. We'll determine based on where we are with the documents and community input the date for the second community forum for a dialogue with the community. And then lastly, the last forum will be June 26th during the Nantucket Preservation Trust Conference. And that's pretty much our presentation. I put Bill and my contact information there, so if you have questions through the process that you would like to, reach out to us, we invite you to do so. But now I'm just kind of going to turn it over. Hopefully, Chuck, you can facilitate any comments or questions that the stakeholders there might have.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, we still have everybody here, or just about everybody here. So, this is a project and, a need that's of very high importance for the community. But I'd like to open it to questions. I only ask that you, use the microphone so we can capture that in the recording. A lot of information here, but we did try to hit, what the target dates are for the strong public participation. Anything you want to add? Oh, please come up. I wish we had a roving microphone.
I know. Everybody needs at least one question to prove people are paying attention.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Judith Wagner. I'm the chair of the planning board. I wondered if you have any advice to give to us if we're here as stakeholders about what you expect our individual boards or entities to be doing to help with this. Is the main idea that we share information about these events and turn people out, or are you expecting us to kind of have done homework ahead of time that we would be sharing? Just if you could elaborate on that, it would help me to take back the insights to the rest of the board. Thank you.
So Lisa, did you hear that?
Bits and pieces of it, Chuck. If you wouldn't mind repeating it, I'd appreciate it.
The question was essentially, and I probably won't get it completely right. How can we look toward the engagement of the boards in this process, and information and having information ahead of time to work effectively, and what their role, as you see it, is conceived to support the project, and obviously they're also a customer as well.
Right. I think Phil and I can both take a hit at this, but because you're all at this meeting, that's the first step of stakeholder involvement. We would say that in terms of information or research, as a planning chair, as a planning commission, obviously you know what the priorities are identified in the various planning documents, and just a refresher of that. is important. Taking a look at the work that was done by Penn, I think, is extremely important. And then other than that, our job is to present this information to you, i.e. the toolkit. So I would encourage the planning commissioners and chair to attend any of the public forums and workshops to learn along with your citizens what the key issues are. And then when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, there may end up being recommendations to carry on that will impact certain planning regulations. But obviously this information feeds very directly into the Brant Point Master Plan and any updates of your town plan. And I would just say, come and attend. Your homework is no different than that at this point. And we have that dialogue. Phil, I know that you usually present or engage with the historic district commissions. You want to talk about that specifically for a minute, and perhaps where the planning commission also intersects that in your experience?
Yeah, I'm certainly looking at holding, a couple of workshops with the Historic District Commission and the Historical Commission while we're there. These are your guidelines, and we're going to tailor these to your community, and we want your input in terms of how you've addressed certain design guideline element situations in the past, and what has worked well, what needs to be looked at in more detail. There's a lot of things that are changing and moving now in terms of energy efficiency, for example, for our historic buildings. Different attitudes towards what really constitutes appropriate infill. So each community I work in seems to have their own kind of approach to this and these kind of design issues, and I certainly want to get that input and that kind of information from the commission.
Thank you, Phil. We have another question that'll be coming shortly. Yep.
I'm Hillary Hedges-Rayport. I'm chair of the Historical Commission. It sounds like you're interested in feedback, so I just have some observations that I made and comments that I want to share, not looking necessarily for a response right now, but...
All right. So could you hold... Hey, Lisa, can you hear her okay?
Yeah, I think if she...
Yeah, if you could use the microphone, a little closer.
Is that better?
That'd be great, because I'd like Lisa to make sure
I'm
she
now
catches
practically
it.
eating the microphone, but here we go. So one of the things, so the Historical Commission was just reactivated last July, so we're a new commission. We work really closely with Holly and we liaise with the Historic District Commission. But whereas there are Architectural Review Board, the Historical Commission is looking, our purview is planning. So this is really of great interest to us, as I know it is to everybody in the room. So I was looking through the FEMA or the National Park Service flood guidelines that were released in November. And one of the questions that came to my mind was, do we need to have an effort to more aggressively landmark or designate historic properties? Would that help us at all? I know that one of the issues that comes up that makes things difficult for the HDC is that homeowners, property owners want to protect their home, and they're even getting pressure from their insurance companies who are saying you need to raise your home this much. It's very hard for them to go back and say, well, we don't really want to do that, or the HDC doesn't want us to do that. And I noticed in those Park Service guidelines that there could be exceptions if a property was of a landmark or designated or of historic interest. So guidance on how we could become a certified local government, how we could do whatever we can to put more protections for these properties that are of great historic interest, maybe not every property, but certain properties. So that was just one of the things on my mind that I would really like feedback on. I think our commission would like feedback on. Another thought that I had was just this on the awareness front. I did attend the Keeping History Above Water meeting, and I just love the idea of how can we raise awareness through art projects there was a concept of putting a flood line. So I don't know if we could bring in the Artist Association. We have this incredible community of creative people here that love to do stuff like this. The Dreamland is really active. They're right on the water. So maybe that's already happening, but that was my second thought. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll jump right onto that second thought. And actually, we just had a meeting yesterday with a group that's working with Penn and the University of Florida, and trying to put together, the communication, the art. Kim, I don't know if you'd like to get up and say something. I'm putting you on the spot. And Kim is with Acclimate.
So basically, Acclimate is working on two possible forms of art, or at least awareness for the public. Both of which are looking at the Artist Association of Nantucket in order to work with them and include the schools and that community aspect as well, to just share as much of the knowledge as we possibly have, raise awareness of what is happening in Nantucket. And also promote Acclimate as well, and the ideas of the community. So,
thank you, Kim. Yeah, I think the whole awareness piece is really the first step in building community support, and so I think it's a multi-channel approach. I think art is significant as a communication vehicle. It gets people's attention. So I think we need to work together to try to figure out how to make that work in the community. I know there are some additional ideas that are being discussed at Acclimate, but please, feel free to, participate and, bring some clever ideas that we probably haven't thought of yet.
Chuck, if I might just respond to the first comment, because I think it was an important one to note. Yes, the National Park Service does have guidelines out now, and we're glad to see those. And what Phil ends up putting in the guidelines will certainly use that as a reference. I think most of us who've worked with Secretary of Interior standards, which are the guidelines, know the sensitivity relative to elevating and relocating buildings. So those are two key issues. But the other thing I would comment on about the value of landmarking properties, an important thing to realize, it is an NHL district. Mitigation or adaptation strategies for buildings, for commercial buildings, are tax credit eligible. So when it comes to the federal historic tax credit, for commercial buildings, for example, on Washington Street and others for adaptation, that is something that can create an incentive. I think one of the things we need to look at as well is, just sharing my experience about the local property tax incentive we created in Annapolis to encourage all property owners, whether it's residential or commercial, to make mitigation improvements that would lessen the impact of sea level rise and flooding on the historic fabric of the buildings. So there are incentives out there that are directly tied to actual landmarked properties. So you need to think about that. And again, that's something that can be a town council, a planning commission, and a historic commission's opportunity to engage on and develop moving forward. So I think that's a valid point to make.
Thank you, Lisa. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Good morning. Stephen Welch, the Nantucket Historic District Commission. Excuse me. I'd just like to thank everyone for the work you put into this. Incredibly important. I would like to say that I think I've heard a couple of different comments. I've heard comments from other attendees, stakeholders. I support those, and they've helped answer questions I've already was going to ask. There are a couple other things I wanted to touch on, just kind of stream of consciousness. One, I'll kind of back into this idea of raising a structure as a mitigation measure. I would suggest that in the toolkit we would provision If a move, where we look at this at the Historic District Commission, but we don't get into the National Register designation for a contributing structure. And a move, my understanding is whether you move up or you move left or right or front or back is still a move. And as such, a structure would need to be redesignated, reapplied for and redesignated. That may or may not be the case, but those are the kinds of levels of details that I think I'm going to suggest that we look into. And then along the lines of that, the MVP program I thought was a really great venue to take a lot of really broad ideas and concepts and narrow them down for not only primarily for support from within the community, but for direction. But in dealing with these types of streetscape characteristics and historical elements, I'm a little concerned. I was very relieved to hear Phil's comments about a couple of work groups with the local commissions.
Yes.
But I'm not positive that two meetings is going to accomplish that. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if you look at the Brant Point area, you could look at Eastern Street and Wall Street, and you really need perhaps to have two different type of, if we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about just simply raising, not any other element, just to demonstrate some of the complexity. There may be two different preferred solutions because of the historic fabric of the area, within the area, 2 blocks from one another. Lower Main Street is the same as compared to North Wharf or Still Dock. And so I think that there is concern within the community about those types of things, and that the due diligence is applied. And I'm not suggesting that you all aren't thinking of that, but I am suggesting that you consider, I understand you're working under the confines of an RFP, but I am suggesting you consider deeper, broader work groups with commissions. I'm not going to speak for the Concom, but I know that it comes up in our meetings at HDC that they have different types of regulations to follow. And I think that that's an important aspect, that they have an opportunity to weigh in a work group setting. I also think I understand the idea of aligning and furthering partnerships outside of the town. However, I think that, and I didn't hear this, and it may just be an omission as opposed to an intention. The final draft, I firmly believe, should be reviewed by the stakeholders for constructive and material input, and perhaps even drafts as it goes along. And that's not a control matter so much as it is an opportunity to work as a team, and we get an opportunity to kind of see if we've missed something. And if not, how we might enhance some aspect of the plan. I'm just a couple other quick things. I'd like to see, can we get a copy of the slides emailed to us from the, excellent.
It'll be on the website as well.
We'll send you a link, yeah.
Cool, thanks. And then I think the other thing I just wanted to ask is, I saw it acclimate in the presentation, and thank you for pointing out about the involvement of the artists. But at the HDC, we've never even heard of this partner. So can we get some more information, like who it is and what their role is and so on and so forth? It doesn't necessarily have to be at this moment, but I think it would be important for people to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Those are all great comments. And I guess I'd like to echo the fact that, you know, we're going to need extensive participation, and maybe 2 workshops is not enough. But, you know, we're kind of stepping into, well, what's really needed here, kind of uncharted territory. And unfortunately, the project schedule became compressed because of some procurement matters, and we had to re-advertise the project. So what we were expecting for a year is really 6 months. I don't want to skimp at all in terms of quality of the work. So, you know, we're definitely time constrained, but I think we're at least going to begin with something and get something accomplished in terms of maybe they won't be final guidelines. Maybe they'll be final draft guidelines that'll set the stage for a potential future project. And I don't see this as just one and done. This is really a journey, you know, that we're just really starting to have this conversation. It is very aggressive to think that we can have a couple of meetings and everybody's going to, you know, agree with that. No, we want to make sure that we get the right people involved. Need strong participation from the community and the boards and commissions. So, yeah, that's my promise.
Thanks. Sorry, this is Hillary again. There were a couple other things that I forgot to mention that were just comments or questions that I had. Just for you, Lisa and Phil, to think about. One of the things that has been taking up some time and that the Historical Commission has been focused on is the streets and the streetscapes. And I know that this is going to be part of what you're looking at, but we're very interested in establishing some kind of guidelines for materials that are compatible with historic artifacts, which is how we view the components in our streets, the 1837 curbs that are carved with steam tools, but not just the material, not just thinking about preservation, but also thinking about sustainability, permeability. So we have a cobblestone Main Street that turns into an absolute river now when it rains hard, and has puddles for days. And it used to be that had a bed of sand. The cobblestones were bedded in sand. Now, the perception or reality is that sand is not as easily available. And so stone dust is the easy button. They're set in stone dust, questions about permeability effect. So I don't know if you're going to get down into that level of detail, but I think are really looking for some guidance. And I think the town is looking for some guidance on that. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is that one of the goal, sort of medium-term goals that the Historical Commission is thinking about is a preservation plan for Nantucket. I mean, we have lots of plans. We have a master plan. We're looking at renewing plans, but we don't actually have a comprehensive preservation plan. And I see this as being potentially a component. Well, if we actually get a preservation plan, this will be a component of this. But could we make this a first step? And, do we want to be explicit about that? That might be helpful. Thank you.
So the way I see it is, we're having the conversation, we're going to have workshops. We definitely need to capture this information because that provides, what the next level of needs are. In terms of the streetscapes and pavement, absolutely. We're not going to go into that level of detail, but we want to identify it as a need so we can scope it as a potential project, maybe a grant project, and then build towards something for that as a long-term solution for the materials. Preservation plan, Holly, maybe you.
I think it's important to note those type of achievable goals. And that will be included, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but this would be something that would be included within your reports, which is in addition to the guidelines themselves. So whatever comes out of these charrettes, these workshops, there's going to be a summary, if you will, of these ideas. And like I've been stressing to a lot of different folks is if we have something identified in a plan, report, what have you, that gives us the power, if you will, to move forward and achieve those goals. You have to have those actions identified in order to accomplish those. So yes, that'd be something that I would think that our consultants would be able to at least capture, provided that everybody does understand what's in the scope of this project.
And Holly, I'm going to put my camp hat on. So the National Alliance Preservation Commissions does community assistance training, mentoring training or commission assistance and mentoring training. And preservation planning is usually one of the modules we talk about. There's a couple ways that we can look at this. I absolutely thought when we ended up doing our CRHMP, our Weather Together plan in Annapolis, it was our preservation plan, because it addressed so many issues around the value of our historic assets and ways in which we could preserve them from this great risk. So it was a component. But there are a lot of ways you can do preservation plans. You can do a separate standalone plan. You can incorporate it as an element within your larger comprehensive plan. It should definitely be an element in your hazard mitigation plan. plan. So sometimes it's even more important to not do it as a standalone, but to incorporate it into other planning documents so that there is buy-in from other agencies for implementation of those components or those elements of preservation. So I think it's important to talk about Holly's right. We'll gather all this information, and it may be a next step, as well as tying into the state's preservation plan, because we all get our guidance from the state down to the local municipality.
Thank you, Lisa. Any other questions? Well, we're just a little beyond our 1 hour. We still have 20 or more people in the room. I'll be available after. Please, feel free to contact Holly. You probably have her contact information. You can contact me as well. And then, Holly, Vince, and myself all work together closely on this issue because it is something that crosses, all parts of the town. Please, this is a participatory process. I have an open door, or please feel free. Ideas. It's got to be a two-way channel of communication here. So I'd love to hear your input and ways to build toward what's going to work best for Nantucket. We're not taking anything from somewhere else and trying to move it into what we would be using for guidelines. We're going to develop what really applies to the community and uniqueness of Nantucket. Any comments, Holly?
No, I'm excited.
No, this is an exciting project. I look forward to working with everyone. Our first workshop, which you'll probably be seeing information on, is March 26th. We will try to, send out communications well in advance every couple of weeks or something, because this is such a compressed schedule. So I hope to hear back from many of you as well. Thank you for attending. Meeting adjourned.